7 neighbors were on their porches when my son told me I wasn't coming. That's the number I kept coming back to afterward, standing in my own driveway with my overnight bag still in my hand and the sound of 3-car engines fading down Crestwood Lane. 7. Not all of them looked away. Old Mel next door watched the whole thing from his front steps with his coffee mug held in both hands, the same way he'd been holding it every Saturday morning since his wife passed 3 years ago. He didn't say anything. I didn't blame him. There wasn't much to say. My name is Gary Danner. I'm 65 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer for a firm in Columbus, Ohio, and I spent the summers of 1989 and 1990 building the house on Crestwood Lane with my own hands, a level and a concrete mixer I borrowed from my brother-in-law who still hasn't let me forget it. My wife Lois picked out every window. She had opinions about windows the way other people have opinions about politics, firm, informed, and entirely correct in retrospect. She died 4 years ago in March, a Tuesday quietly, the way she did most things she didn't want to make a fuss about. I had been ready to go. That's the part that still catches me when I think about it. I'd packed Thursday night the way I always do. Toiletries, 2 changes of clothes, the small bottle of Lois's perfume I keep in my bag because the smell of it makes long drives feel less long. My son had told me about the trip 2 weeks earlier, a long weekend up at Lake Erie, a rental house his friend had access to. The whole family, he'd said on the phone. I'd written it on my calendar in the kitchen, the paper one I've kept on the refrigerator for 30 years, and counted the days the way I hadn't counted days, since Lois was still around to give me something to look forward to. Saturday morning I came down the back stairs at 7:15 with my bag over my shoulder and found the driveway already half loaded. Seth's Tahoe was packed to the roof. Beside it, my daughter-in-law's Audi, luggage organized in the trunk with the precision of a woman who'd done this before. And behind both of them, a rented SUV I didn't recognize, which I understood when I saw her parents, Bert and Lucille Holcomb, climbing out of it. They'd apparently flown in from Dallas for the occasion. Bert Holcomb was 67, retired from a career in commercial lending, and carried himself the way men do who've spent decades deciding whether other people's plans were worth financing. He shook my hand with his full grip and said nothing beyond my name. Seth was loading a cooler into the back of the Tahoe when he saw me. He looked at the bag on my shoulder. Something moved across his face, not quite surprise, not quite relief, but something in between that I didn't have a name for yet. Dad. He said it carefully, the way you say a name when you're about to disappoint the person it belongs to. I should have called you. I thought Kendra did. Called me about what? He gestured toward the vehicles, toward the Holcombs, toward my daughter-in-law who was now watching us from beside the Audi with her sunglasses already on, and her arms folded in a way that told me she'd been expecting this conversation. This trip, it's really Bert and Lucille's time, you know. They flew all the way up here. It's sort of a family thing for them. I don't think it makes sense for you too. For me to what? He didn't answer directly. He looked at my bag. It's not a big place, and we've got a full house already. You'd be more comfortable here. I'll call you tonight. He reached over and took the bag gently from my hand, carried it 3 steps to the right, and set it down against the brick of the front porch. He set it down, the way you set down something you're returning, something that didn't belong where it had been. Lucille Holcomb's window came down then. She was already settled in the back seat of the rented SUV with a travel blanket across her lap and a pleasant expression that didn't reach her eyes. We'll take pictures for you, Gary, she said. I know it's not easy at your age, all that driving. I was 65. I'd driven to Florida twice in the past year, but I didn't say that. Seth was already getting into the Tahoe. He didn't look back at me. My daughter-in-law was the last one to leave. She paused at her car door and looked at me the way you look at a problem you've decided is no longer your responsibility. Don't take it personally, she said. We'll do something with you when we get back. Then the door closed with that particular soft click of an expensive car, and all 3 vehicles backed out of the driveway in sequence. 7 neighbors. None of them spoke. I stood in my driveway in the July morning until the last engine sound was gone, and then I picked up my overnight bag, went inside, and sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee I didn't drink. The house was very quiet. I had grown accustomed to the quiet in the years since Lois died, but this was different. This was the quiet of a place that had just told me something I hadn't been paying attention to. I thought about the night before. Specifically, I thought about 2:30 in the morning when I'd gotten up for water and heard my daughter-in-law's voice carrying from the guest room at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. A line of light ran along the floor. I hadn't meant to stop, but I heard my name, and something in the tone of it planted my feet before I made a conscious decision to stay. Your father doesn't even realize how much space he takes up, she was saying. Her voice was patient, The reasonable voice of someone explaining something that should already be obvious. My parents flew here. They're not paying to sit in a car for 3 hours listening to him talk about Lois. Seth said something I couldn't make out. It's one weekend. He'll be fine. He's not some fragile. She paused. He's just used to being the center of everything. That was fine when your mom was alive. But that chapter is over. We're the ones building something now. My parents need to see that. They need to see us without him. A longer pause, the creak of the bed frame. Yeah, Seth said. You're right. 2 words. That was all it took. Not hesitation, not pushback, not even a breath of resistance. Just 2 words, the same 2 words a person uses when they've already decided and are simply waiting for permission to stop feeling guilty about it. I walked back to my bedroom. I lay on my side of the bed and stared at the ceiling. I did not sleep. Lois had tried to tell me something once, in the last months before she got sick. She'd said it the way she said difficult things, quietly looking at the window instead of at me. I don't think Kendra is who she presents herself to be, she'd said. Just that. She never elaborated, and I never pushed her, because she had the grace to say hard things only once, and trust that I'd eventually find my way to them on my own. I was finding my way. At 6 in the morning, before anyone else came downstairs, I walked through every room of the house the way you walk through a place when you're reconsidering your relationship with it. The living room, with its oak floors I'd refinished twice. The fireplace Lois had insisted on, even though we lived in Ohio, and she spent most winters under a blanket on the couch, complaining it wasn't warm enough. The kitchen table where she'd graded papers, she'd taught middle school English for 22 years, and where I'd eaten breakfast alone every day for 4 years since she left. I went to my study and opened the filing cabinet where I keep the documents that matter. The deed to the house was in a red folder. The will was in a blue one. I opened the blue folder and read the first page. Then I put it back. Then I made coffee and started making calls. The first call was to the bank. I have a joint credit card, joint in name only, meaning I'm the account holder, and Seth has been an authorized user for 6 years. He'd asked me to add him when he was between jobs, and I'd never thought to revisit the arrangement. I pulled up the last 3 months of statements on my laptop before I dialed. I added up the charges I didn't recognize. A hotel in Gatlinburg, 140. A spa in Asheville, 490. Restaurants I'd never heard of. Charges at a ski rental place in February. By the time I'd gone back 90 days, the number was $4,180. I told the bank I needed to remove an authorized user. The representative processed it without drama and told me the change would take effect within 24 hours. The second call was to my doctor's office. 3 months earlier, I'd gotten a letter, routine stuff, I'd thought, confirmation of an appointment, but now I logged into the patient portal out of habit and noticed something I'd overlooked before. In the clinical records field, someone had added a note, family reports patient demonstrating early indicators of cognitive decline. Family requests oversight flag for future decisions. The note was time-stamped February, the same week Seth and my daughter-in-law had come to help me organize the garage. I called the office and asked directly who had placed that note on my file. They couldn't tell me specifically, but they confirmed no physician had ordered the flag. It had come through an administrative request, and that I had every right to have it removed immediately. I asked them to remove it and to note that I had done so. My voice was steady the entire time. The third call was to my attorney. I'd known Jeff Alderman since the 90s, when he'd handled the refinancing on the house after interest rates dropped. I called his cell, and he picked up on the third ring. I told him about the credit card and the medical file. Then I asked whether he'd noticed anything unusual in the past year regarding my property. There was a pause, not hesitant, the pause of a man who'd been waiting to have this conversation. "Gary," he said, "I need to tell you something I should have told you 6 months ago. I received a letter last November from a title company in Cleveland. They were flagging an inquiry on your property deed. Someone had submitted a request to add a co-owner, a quitclaim form with your name on it, that didn't match your notarized signature on file. The title company flagged it as irregular and didn't process it." I set down my coffee cup. "The inquiry was submitted by your son," Jeff said. I called him, and he told me it was a misunderstanding, that he'd been trying to get some estate planning documents in order, and the wrong form had gone out by mistake. I gave him the benefit of the doubt. I shouldn't have. I should have called you right then. "You're calling me now," I said. I called the locksmith next and scheduled a rekeying for noon. Then I called Paula Reeves, a real estate agent I'd worked with years ago who knew my neighborhood better than anyone. I'd been thinking about selling for a while, even before this morning, even before last night. The house was too large for one person. I'd just been waiting for a reason to stop waiting. Paula called me back before the locksmith arrived. Gary, I've been meaning to reach out for 2 months, she said. You know the commercial development moving into the Crestwood corridor? I knew. A grocery chain had bought the old hardware store lot at the end of the block. The county finalized a mixed-use zoning revision 3 weeks ago. It covers your block. I have 2 developers who've specifically asked about corner lots in this stretch. Your lot is a corner lot. She told me the number they'd been discussing. I made her repeat it. It was considerably more than I would have guessed. More than Seth would have guessed. More, I suspected, than Bert Holcomb had calculated in whatever conversations he'd been having about my property's future. Call them, I said. No public listing. I want this quick and clean. The locksmith came and went. I put one new key on the hook by the kitchen door and one in the desk drawer. Seth's spare key, the one I'd given him years ago when Lois was sick so he could check on her, now opened nothing. I noted this without particular feeling. I slept 7 hours that night, the most I'd slept in 4 years. By Tuesday, I had a purchase offer on my laptop. I read it twice, not because I didn't understand it, but because some numbers deserve to be read more than once before you let them change your life. Seth called 6 times while he was at the lake. I watched his name appear on my screen each time and let it ring. He texted 3 times. The last one, Tuesday evening, said, "Heading home tomorrow. Everything okay? Can you make sure the spare key is under the mat?" I did not respond. Wednesday morning, I signed the purchase agreement with a cup of coffee that was still hot. Then I called Jeff and told him to begin drawing up the estate amendment we'd discussed. The charitable trust in Lois's name, her memorial scholarship fund at the school, where she'd taught, designated as the primary beneficiary of the property's proceeds. At 4 o'clock, I heard 3 car engines turning onto Crestwood Lane. I watched through the curtain. Seth's Tahoe came first, slower than usual, the careful speed of a man returning to something he believes belongs to him. My daughter-in-law's Audi behind it, the rental SUV last. Seth parked and got out with the ease of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. He reached into his jacket pocket for his key ring, walked to the front door and put the key in. He tried it twice, then the side door, then the garage keypad, whose code I'd changed Saturday afternoon. The panel beeped once and the light stayed red. My daughter-in-law walked up behind him. "What's happening?" "Lock isn't working." "Did you try?" "Yes." She looked at the house with the expression she used when a situation had stopped following the script she'd written for it. Bert and Lucille climbed out of the rental SUV. Bert assessed the scene with the practiced calm of a man who'd learned to hide his concern behind composure. Seth called my phone. I watched it ring on the kitchen table. I let it ring through. He called again. Then I answered. "Dad." His voice was controlled in the way of a man working hard to stay that way. "The lock's changed. What's going on?" "I know," I said. "I'll be out in a moment." I went out the front door, down the porch steps, across the lawn. 7 neighbors were visible from where I walked, different arrangement than Saturday morning, but the same street, the same July light. I walked to my own front gate and stopped on my side of it. Seth looked at me through the iron bars with an expression I hadn't seen on his face since he was about 12 years old and had broken something that mattered. "Dad, what is this?" Before I could answer, a car I recognized pulled up behind the rental SUV. Jeff Alderman got out with a file folder. Behind him, the real estate company's installation truck. 2 men unloaded a yard sign and carried it across the lawn. Bert Holcomb walked forward 3 steps and read the sign. His chin drew back slightly. He looked at me. He looked at Seth. "You're selling?" Seth's voice broke on the second word. "I accepted an offer Tuesday," I said. "I want to talk to you about some other things before you say anything else." I looked past him at Bert, including the conversation that happened in my living room 3 weeks ago when someone raised a glass to Patience. Bert went very still, the specific stillness of a man who has just understood that the room he thought he was controlling had a security camera he didn't know about. Seth turned slowly to look at his father-in-law. "What does that mean?" Jeff opened his folder on the hood of Seth's Tahoe and laid out 3 documents, loan applications, financial disclosure forms, all listing 412 Crestwood Lane as Seth's primary residence. "Fraudulent," Jeff said quietly and clearly, because Seth had not lived at this address in 11 years and had no legal claim to represent it as his own. And beneath those, a copy of the flagged quitclaim form from the title company. Seth's name, my signature, forged. Mel walked to the fence line between our properties. He was 68 years old, a retired contractor who'd lived next door since Clinton was in office. He'd helped me build the back porch the summer Lois asked for one. He hadn't said a word Saturday morning when the cars pulled away. He was saying something now. "I've been on this street longer than most of you've been alive," Mel said, not raising his voice, not needing to. "I watched this man build this house. I watched him raise his son in it. I watched him get left behind in his own driveway without anybody saying a word. He looked directly at Seth. I should have said something Saturday. I'm saying it now. Seth wasn't looking at Mel. He was looking at the documents on the hood of his own car. Then he looked at my daughter-in-law. "The quitclaim form," he said quietly. "Was that you?" Her jaw tightened. "I was trying to protect our future. By forging my father's signature. It was never filed. It didn't." "Kendra." His voice cracked on her name. "It was never filed because the title company caught it." My phone rang. My sister Clarice, calling from Portland. I told her to call at 4:15. I answered and switched to speaker without explaining why, because what she had to say had been kept quiet long enough. "Gary." Her voice was steady, the voice she'd used for 30 years in the classroom. "2 years ago, I got a call from a woman who introduced herself as your daughter-in-law. She said she was calling because she was worried about you, that you were lonely, losing track of things, that Seth was doing his best but your estate planning wasn't fair to him given everything he was doing." A pause. "She asked me to suggest you revisit your will. Said it would be better coming from family. She was very warm about it." Nobody on the street made a sound. "I said no," Clarice continued. "I told her your affairs were your business, and if she had concerns, she should raise them with you directly." She thanked me politely and hung up. Then I made a mistake. "I tried to tell you 2 months later. You told me I was being too hard on her, that she was just looking out for the family." Something rougher came into her voice. "I should have pushed harder. I'm sorry I didn't." "You were right," I said. "I know." My daughter-in-law was not looking at Seth. She was looking at a point somewhere above the hood of the Tahoe, with the focused expression of a woman who has decided that waiting for this particular moment to end is the only available strategy. Seth turned to Bert. "You told me this house was going to be our foundation," he said. "You and Lucille have been talking about it like it was already decided." Bert's composure had bent without quite breaking. "We were discussing reasonable expectations," he said. "Your father is 65. At some point these things need to." "It's not your house to have expectations about," Seth said. Bert made a quiet decision visible only in the straightening of his jacket. He said something low to Lucille. She reached into the rental SUV for her handbag. They said goodbye to their daughter. They did not say goodbye to Seth. The rental backed out of the driveway and turned south on Crestwood, and that was that. My daughter-in-law watched the SUV until it turned the corner. Then she picked up her keys. "I can't do this right now," she said to no one specifically. She got into her Audi. She sat there a long moment. Then the engine started and she pulled away in the opposite direction from her parents' car. Seth looked at the space where her car had been. He looked at the for sale sign in my lawn. He looked at the documents Jeff was sliding back into the folder. Then he looked at me. He sat down on the curb. Not a fall, a deliberate, exhausted lowering of himself onto the concrete of my driveway, the concrete I'd poured myself 30 years ago. He pressed his hands over his face. He was 40 years old, sitting on the curb of his childhood home, and I had been his father for every year of those 40. I walked to the gate and opened it outward, toward the street. I stepped through. I sat down on the curb beside him, because my knees are still good enough for that, and because some things are better said from the same level. "Let me go first," I said. He lowered his hands and nodded. "I am your father," I said. "That doesn't have an expiration date, but being your father doesn't mean being a resource you draw from. It doesn't mean being an address you put on loan applications or a signature you put on forms I never signed. It doesn't mean being someone who fades quietly into the background while other people make plans about what he owns." I kept my voice even. "Not cold, there's a difference. Cold is a weapon. Even is just the truth without decoration. You stopped seeing me as a person somewhere along the way. I don't know exactly when, but I know I made it easier than I should have. I fixed things before they became consequences for you. That was my failure as much as anything else." He was quiet for a moment. "The quitclaim form," he finally said. "I didn't know about that until today. I need you to believe that." "I believe it," I said, and I did. There were 2 separate problems here, and one of them was his, and one of them was his wife's, and they had been braided together long enough that he'd stopped being able to see where one ended and the other began. "What do I do?" he asked. His voice was raw in a way I hadn't heard since he was a kid. "I can't answer that. That's the part you work out yourself, which is what I should have let you do 20 years ago instead of smoothing every road." I looked at the sign in my lawn. "The house will sell. I've had a place on the West Side for 2 years. Smaller, quieter. I'm looking forward to it." He looked at me for a long time. "Can I come see it?" "Yes," I said. "Call first. Come alone, not to ask for anything, just to come." "Just to come," he repeated quietly, the way a man tests the weight of a simple thing. We sat on the curb together for a while. Mel went back inside. The other neighbors drifted away. The late afternoon light settled over Crestwood Lane the way it always had, indifferent and golden, the same light that had come through these windows every summer evening for 31 years. Lois used to say it turned the kitchen into a painting for about 20 minutes each day if you were paying attention. I had not been paying attention to enough things. I was paying attention now. The sale closed on a Thursday in September. I walked through the house one final time early that morning, touching the doorframe where I'd marked Seth's height every birthday until he was 16 and called it embarrassing. Touching the kitchen windowsill where Lois had kept a row of African violets, which I'd kept alive for 4 years after she died, by following her handwritten instructions on a notacard tucked behind the pot. I took the note card. I took the photograph of her standing in the backyard the summer we finished the porch, squinting into the sun with her hand raised, laughing at something I'd said, the garden enormous and slightly wild behind her. I took the small wooden stool she'd used to reach the high shelves, because it had her handprints worn into the wood, and because some things you keep, not because they're useful, but because they're true. The new place was a 2-bedroom condo on the 3rd floor of a building on the west side of Columbus, with a balcony that faced the park. I'd bought it 14 months earlier, with cash from 30 years of living within my means. I'd been paying the HOA fees and waiting for the rest of my life to catch up to it. October came. Seth called on a Sunday. He said he'd found an apartment in Clintonville, that he and Kendra were separating, that he'd started seeing a therapist, and it was harder than he'd expected but useful. He said he was figuring things out slowly. It was the most honest sentence he'd spoken to me in years. Good, I said. That's good. Can I come by? He asked. I won't ask you for anything. Saturday, I said. I'll make lunch. He came. He brought nothing. We sat on the balcony and ate sandwiches and watched the park and didn't talk about any of the things that had happened, because some things need more distance before the wound, underneath the words, has finished closing. At one point he looked out at the view and said, "She would have liked this." He was right. Lois would have been out here every morning with her tea and her paperback before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. She would have found a name for the exact color of light that came across the treetops at 7:30, and she would have been exactly right about it. Yeah, I said, she would have. We sat there a while longer, and the city moved below us with no interest in what had been lost, or what was still being worked out, or what might yet be recovered. And I found, in that October sun with a cup of coffee, still warm between my hands, and my son sitting quietly beside me, that this was enough. Not perfect, not finished, but enough, which at 65 I've learned is not a small thing to be.